Simon, I want to start, though, with the big news at home, the passing of the golden tonsils, John Laws, the king of talkback radio. Simon, as someone, you worked with politicians for many years on the Labor side. They all had to engage with the king of talkback.
Yeah, look, I mean, John was a phenomenal character. I mean, obviously dominated not only the Sydney radio market, but obviously a lot of regional New South Wales and up into Queensland. Was just a constant voice and a conversation the politicians had through him with the Australian people. A different time, a different era. I think it's fair to say that the power that those radio figures had back then isn't as true today. It's not to say that the current generation of radio hosts aren't influential and aren't listened to, but it's also probably fair to say that it's much more now that FM market, people like Kyle and Jackie O, who actually have as much influence in terms of radio listenership as the more traditional sort of AM type markets. But John was a unique character. I mean, a great radio broadcaster. You could definitely have a conversation with him and through him to the Australian people. But of course, he had so many different angles to him. I mean, his country music was a big part of his life and his promotion, but also his poetry as well, which maybe not a lot of younger Australians are familiar with, but simple, but nonetheless quite effective poetry as well. And
a sense of fun. Obviously, our viewers would be well aware of the difficulties through the cash for comment saga. He always denied wrongdoing. Peter McGauran through that process, but he was an individual who did bring a sense of fun to broadcasting. And I think, as Simon sort of touched on some really interesting points there, the talkback radio titans of the day were really the original influencers, weren't they? That's Tom Malone was on with me earlier,
correct.
The head of 9 Radio, and he was making that point.
True, and John Laws, of course, he had to stir things up and he had to demonise and have a hero as opposed to a victim or a downtrodden. So he played the game beautifully, but he did it without unnecessary rancour or lasting enmity. That was my observation of him. And importantly for the National Party, we knew he reached far corners of our constituency. So we were just as attuned to John Laws as the major parties were.
Yeah, good point. And, we've got to touch on another titan that we lost at the weekend. It was a sad few days. They both lived very rich lives, Lawsy and Richo. But two individuals where one name says it all. It's not often characters, Simon, are known by just the one name, but you say Richo, everyone knows in political circles who you're talking about. What a legend. We'll miss him. He was on this program 1 week ago. His last appearance on TV was here on Newsday. We'll always remember him so fondly, and a very generous person to those that he worked with, including myself, Simon, over many years. Yeah,
look, Kieran, can I just say, to you, the Sky family, who I know he'll be feeling Richo's passing, quite deeply. He was a great mentor, I think, to a lot of people, both with inside politics and with inside, Sky News and other media outlets. A fierce political intellect, a really clever strategist in terms of those sorts of things. Yes, controversial, and obviously got himself into a lot of trouble at times, but the fact that when you see the condolences coming out from everything from the far right of Australian politics, through to people like Bob Brown on the left, who celebrated his achievements as Environment Minister, this was a person who was capable of speaking to anyone, to understanding political problems in clever and unique ways, and very good at finding solutions. So, look, a giant. I don't think we'll see a political figure like him again, but he'll be missed.
Yeah, he will be, and a character. He would be the first to say he was no saint, but I tell you what, he was a very loyal person, Peter McGauran, a wonderful communicator, the best political analyst I've seen in over 20 years of covering it. And election nights, they won't be the same without him, Peter.
Oh, I agree. He was incisive, to the point, and usually accurate and brave in his calling of elections, earlier rather than later in a night. We both entered Parliament in the old Parliament House in 1983. I was neither an ally nor an opponent of his, but he'd often stop in the corridor just to exchange pleasantries. I think the secret of his success, Kieran and Simon, is he loved people. There was no reason for him to talk to me. I was a nobody junior opposition backbencher, but he'd passed the time of day, but he seemed to me traversing King's Hall from the Senate side over to the Prime Ministerial and Treasurer's offices, always in a hurry. I can't keep track of how many times I'd see him cross over in the course of a day. He was a very close friend of Peter Reith, who was my best friend in politics, and he went to Peter Reith's funeral almost three years ago to the day, and he wasn't well, and it was a very hot day. And the fact that he went, and it was a very long ceremony, is testimony to his goodness and his bipartisanship.
Yeah, good point. He did have that innate goodness and generosity of spirit. There is no doubt about that, having seen him up close for so long, and the tenacity is just unbelievable to keep fighting and fighting. He wanted to be there until his son finished his HSC. He did last Thursday. Richo passed away a couple of days later. Just the resilience of his spirit was quite something. Simon, well, let's just finish, if we can, on more mundane matters, just the politics of this week. There's a lot at stake here for Susan Lee in her political career.
Well, there certainly is. Look, I think the coalition have got their kind of talking points to sort of take them out of this week. I think we're even seeing with the kind of last foray of the so-called Liberal moderates an attempt to try and modify some of that rhetoric. I think the real problem, as I've kept saying, Kieran, all along, it's fine to have your slogans right. The problem is your policy has got to match it, and particularly on energy policy. I'm going to be blunt. I don't think these guys have got a clue. I think they're going to get it wrong, just as they did at the last election, maybe in a different form. But they don't know the answers to the problems because they're tough. They're difficult to solve. But this transition is happening, and sooner or later, the Conservative side of politics needs to understand that if we don't make these changes, we're going to end up in a hell of a bad place.
Peter McGauran, what are your thoughts on how this week unfolds? As I said, not just for Susan Lee, the opposition generally to wrap up the year. It's a pivotal few days.
Oh, absolutely, Kieran. In fact, I think it's arguably the most important week in the history of the Liberal Party, because if they get this wrong, they lose a leader. Perhaps not immediately, but within the next few months. And if the policy's wrong, they will go backwards at the next election and lose more seats. They're facing an existential crisis as it is, let alone if they can't gain new urban seats or lose them. Look, there's so much fog around this. It's hard to separate the political from the policy agendas, moderate, Conservative, National Party, Liberal Party, disaffected backbenchers attacking the leader. But there is a chance for her to get it right. What we know is net zero, as it's understood by the Liberal Party at the moment, is gone. But what do they replace it with? And I think, as Simon would say, that's the challenge. If you get rid of the phrase net zero, what do you put in its place that will resonate on the hustings? So they can get it right. If they do, Susan Lee then has a light at the end of the tunnel, because everybody loves a survivor in politics. You build your street cred with your colleagues and with the media if you overcome adversity. So it's a fascinating week, but everything's at stake.
That's, yeah, well said. I think that there's always a possibility if you can get through those low points that into the new year, who knows what's going to happen. Simon and Peter McGauran, thank you. Simon Banks, we'll talk to you next week.